Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things and unexpected discoveries you can make if you just take the time to learn. I'm Mark, your host this week, and as always, I am joined by Joe, an old friend from college. And together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. How's it going, Joe?
All right, doing well. How about you?
I think breathlessly waiting for January 20th to see if we have a peaceful handover of power.
Or the Second Civil War, as the case may be.
Yeah, hopefully not. Hopefully the people with guns are outnumbered by the people who are a little bit more committed to what this country stands for. But I guess we're going to see how that all goes. So, I mean, as easy as it would be for us to talk about politics once again, I thought it would be nice this week to veer a little bit away to a separate but related topic, which is one of the outcomes of the elections this year is that my neighboring state of Oregon legalized a whole bunch of drugs, which put me on the topic of drug legalization in general. And that's a topic I've been hearing about a lot for quite a bit as a potential resolution of the war on drugs. And I have some mixed feelings about it, so I asked you to take a look at it. And I asked you a question in three parts. What are the arguments for and against legalization? Are we talking about the legalization of all drugs or just some of them? And do you, Joe, think it's a good idea? So tell me what you think.
Well, there's a lot to say about this subject, so I'm going to get right to it. I want to take your second question first. Are we talking about the legalization of all drugs or just some of them? The answer is it depends on whom you're talking to. Before I explain that, I need to raise a point of semantics that's relevant to this question. There are two terms commonly used to describe what we want to do vis-a-vis drugs. Legalization, which is the way you phrased it in your question, and decriminalization. They have slightly different definitions. Legalization is the process of removing all legal prohibitions against a drug. It would then be available to the general population of adults for purchase and use at will, similar to how we treat tobacco and alcohol. There's two models for legalization. Full, unfettered legalization of all drugs is recommended by libertarians, but I think that's an outlier position.
Yes, libertarian positions most generally are outlier positions, but so yes.
Yeah. So most serious advocates of legalization push for what they call regulated legalization, where drugs would be legally available, but under government controls like labeling, age limitations, restrictions on advertising, that kind of thing. Again, like tobacco and alcohol.
Right. So, for instance, we have beer commercials all over television, but at the end it says, please drink responsibly. And if cigarette companies, for instance, were exposed marketing cigarettes to children, they would be in a lot of trouble.
Right. Yeah, and I think you can't actually drink the beer on camera in beer commercials either.
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
Understand correctly, but yeah, that's an example. So decriminalization is simply the act of removing criminal sanctions relating to possession of a drug. It would remain illegal to use drugs, and the manufacturing or selling of drugs would still carry a criminal penalty, but the legal system wouldn't prosecute anybody for possession of that drug under a specified amount, meaning no jail time, no criminal record if you use drugs. The penalties for drug use would range from nothing at all for some drugs in some jurisdictions to civil fines or mandatory drug education or drug treatment. The latter two are known as harm reduction strategies. Portugal decriminalized drugs in 2001 by treating possession as a public health issue instead of a law enforcement issue. In the Portuguese model, which is seen as a success thus far, the drug kingpins and traffickers are still dealt with as criminals, while the low-level user is viewed as a sick person in need of treatment.
Right.
So to answer your question, I think the mainstream view among people who want to change the way we deal with drugs is either to do regulated legalization of all drugs or decriminalization of all drugs, a la Portugal, for reasons that I'm going to detail for you later. Before offering reasons pro and con, I want to sketch out a brief and hopefully interesting history of drug use and the so-called war on drugs that the legalization movement is seeking to undo. So when did the war on drugs start? You want to take a guess at that, Mark?
I know in the circles that I run into, it's often associated with Nancy Reagan's "Just Say No to Drugs."
Yes.
But I imagine its roots go a little bit deeper than that. But maybe as a formal war on drugs, using that as a rallying cry, it would date back to that period.
Right. So we're contemporaries who lived through the 80s together for a portion of that time. And I knew you would mention Nancy Reagan. Many people think this war on drugs has been around only since political conservatives became ascendant in the 1970s and 1980s, and we were all instructed to just say no. But it's actually been around a lot longer than that.
Yeah, particularly if you count alcohol, because we got prohibition way back in the 1910s and 20s. But I'm sure you can be getting to that.
Yes, I sure will. I just want to digress a minute on Just Say No. There's a really funny video floating around the internet that I first heard as an audio tape back in the late 80s. It's like a primitive deep fake that cleverly edits a televised address given by President and Mrs. Reagan in September 1986. Nancy Reagan, as you mentioned, was the national spokesperson for the Just Say No movement, which was much ridiculed even at the time. I'm sure you remember. Mm-hmm. You can Google the words "Ron and Nancy say yes to drugs" and watch or listen to the edited tape on YouTube. It's well worth 6 minutes of your time. Okay. Drug prohibition efforts started long before the 1970s, but in the grand scheme of things, their origins are still relatively recent. For most of human history, there were no laws or even cultural norms against drug use. In fact, some scholars have argued that the desire to alter one's consciousness is fundamental for human beings. Psychoactive drugs have been used by people in all cultures and every era of human history. Just as Americans of European descent use wine in some religious ceremonies, Native Americans use peyote and tobacco. Native South Americans take coca breaks the way we in the USA take coffee breaks. Many Muslim countries tolerate the use of marijuana and opium the way Westerners tolerate alcohol. In other words, drug use has been long baked into the cake, or perhaps I should say the hash brownie.
Yeah, I'll even throw in a 2,000-year-old reference, which is that there's some speculation that in ancient Greece, religious mysteries were celebrated with drinking a psychoactive liquid that was brewed up from grains and mushrooms and maybe poppies. It's completely unproven, but there's been some speculation.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but I'm not at all surprised to hear about it, and I'm inclined to believe it is true. So in the 19th century, the opium derivative morphine, which is a pharmacological cousin to heroin, was found to have pain-killing properties. It was used widely during the Civil War and left a lot of addicted soldiers in its wake. After the war, morphine's use grew as it became the main ingredient in a number of patented medicines. Late in the 19th century, marijuana was used to treat insomnia, rheumatism, and migraine headaches, while cocaine was used for things like chronic fatigue, hay fever, and sinusitis, in addition to being a common ingredient in wines and soda, including, most famously, Coca-Cola.
Yeah, Sigmund Freud was a big advocate of cocaine for a while there, wasn't he?
I don't know, but that sounds plausible.
Yeah, I believe I read that he used it in his therapy for a period of time before eventually souring on it.
I do know that in the world of popular literature at that time, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle portrayed his greatest character, Sherlock Holmes, as a cocaine addict.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Until 1912, heroin was sold over the counter as a key ingredient in some cough syrups. Doctors prescribed heroin for a variety of conditions, including bronchitis, hysteria, menstrual cramps, and even for irritable babies. I could just see that last one. Honey, make sure to add some smack to Junior's formula so we can sleep tonight.
Yeah, those babies were jonesing hard back in the day, weren't they?
I'm sure there were a lot of addicts as a result of over-the-counter heroin being prescribed for irritable babies.
Though I've never heard of people drinking heroin. It's always shooting it up, right?
Yeah.
So I wonder if the effect is quite as intense if it's absorbed through the stomach lining.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so, some of the people who favor legalization, by the way, want to return our country to this pre-20th century condition where drugs were legal and could be used medicinally or recreationally. But in the early 20th century, things changed. The country was gripped by a fever called temperance, spurred on by activist groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Temperance literally means moderation or restraint, but these folks were really pressing for abstinence, and they got it. The first federal law in this area was the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, passed by Congress in 1914, which banned cocaine and opiates. The prohibition of alcohol soon followed, and by 1919, with passage of the 18th Amendment, the United States had become a self-proclaimed dry nation, the prohibition you mentioned a minute ago. Of course, people didn't stop using alcohol and other drugs. They just started getting arrested and going to jail for doing so. Prohibition also meant the emergence of huge black markets for these substances, operated by criminals and characterized by violence. The 21st Amendment ended up repealing the prohibition of alcohol just 14 years later in 1933, which led almost immediately to state laws and local ordinances regulating the potency, quality, and commercial sale of alcohol products, while the black market for alcohol virtually disappeared. However, the federal prohibition of heroin and cocaine stayed on the books, and in 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which criminalized pot. In so doing, they were undoubtedly influenced by the towering cinematic achievement that was the 1936 propaganda film Reefer Madness, which you can also watch on YouTube if you're so inclined. Have you ever seen that, Mark?
I have seen scenes of it, and it's basically, it is a representation of marijuana clearly depicted by people who had never come within 20 miles of marijuana and have no real sense of how that drug influenced you.
Yes.
Because they seem to have imagined that it was some variety of super heroin or cocaine that gets people really, really amped up.
Yes, it's worth watching if you haven't seen it, folks. It's a kitschy brilliance. Though the groundwork was set by these earlier laws, the catchphrase war on drugs really didn't come into vogue until 1971, when President Nixon declared illegal drug use to be public enemy number one, probably in reaction to reports from Vietnam that as many as 10 to 15% of our GIs were using heroin. The Reagans popularized the term with their Just Say No efforts in the 1980s, and Presidents Bush and Clinton beefed up funding for drug enforcement while Congress passed a draconian crime bill, authored by Joe Biden, that established the prison industrial complex that exists today. Public opinion about the war on drugs really didn't begin to change until the 21st century. A Zogby poll taken in October 2008 found that 3 in 4 Americans believed the war on drugs was failing. A 2014 poll from the Pew Research Center found over 60% of Americans approving of state governments moving away from mandatory prison terms for drug violations. That's a substantial shift since 2001.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine looking at the war on drugs and thinking everything is going great, unless you're the sort of person who thinks that incarceration itself is a good thing. Because I don't know of anyone who would believe that drugs are now less easy to get or that fewer people are dying from it.
Right.
Certainly the news today is full of stories quite the opposite.
Right.
So, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that public opinion is shifting on it.
So Pew also reported in 2014 that 67% of Americans favored treatment over prosecution for using drugs like cocaine and heroin. And in 2018, a Rasmussen poll found fewer than 10% of Americans believing that the war on drugs was being waged successfully, which conforms with what you just said.
And that's an astonishing figure because we
it?
never have 90% of Americans agreeing on anything except for this, apparently. Because that has to cut across Democratic, Republican, Independent. We all think that the war is going very poorly.
Yes, and I'm going to say something about that later in the realm of strange bedfellows for drug legalization. So let's put a pin in that for the moment. Before I get to your question about the pros and cons of legalization, which is really the heart of the matter, I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute, Mark. What do you think would happen if we legalized or decriminalized drugs tomorrow?
That's really two separate questions, isn't it? I'd say if we decriminalized, probably the impact would not be immense. I would say probably the effect would be relatively mild, but generally positive in that there would be fewer spurious convictions sending people to prison for no good reason.
Yeah.
And particularly if we're talking about heroin, cocaine, that sort of thing, meth, I would say that decriminalization, if it shifts the focus towards treatment rather than punishment, then that would probably be a social good. I could get behind that. Legalization, that scenario, if it were to happen tomorrow, would scare me because I look at companies like R.J. Reynolds and how irresponsible they were around the health effects of tobacco, for instance, where they were sponsoring doctors to issue spurious studies to question the link between cigarettes and cancer, and lobbying the government over the course of decades and coming up with Joe Camel as a cartoon character in the hopes that it would encourage young people to take up smoking. And just that version of capitalism is deeply, deeply irresponsible, and I shudder to think what would happen if it put its weight behind something like heroin or methamphetamines.
Very interesting. I'm going to get back to some of the things you said as we go through the reasons for and against legalization. But one thing you didn't say that I was kind of expecting you to say is you didn't weigh in with an opinion on whether drug use would spike after drugs became decriminalized or legalized.
Yes.
And most people think there would likely be a surge in the use of whichever drugs we legalized. But here's the interesting thing. Whether that surge would create greater problems than the status quo is a matter of fierce debate. Here's an example of that debate. In an online manifesto entitled Against Drug Prohibition, the American Civil Liberties Union points out that, quote, once alcohol prohibition was repealed, consumption increased somewhat, but the rate of liver cirrhosis went down because people tended to choose beer and wine over the more potent distilled spirits previously promoted by bootleggers, end quote. In a climate of prohibition, illegal markets are controlled by producers, not consumers. Those producers encourage the production and consumption of more potent and dangerous forms of the drug because that's how they make the most profit.
Yeah.
Drug legalization would therefore lead to an increase in drug use, but a decrease in drug abuse, particularly if some of the money saved on law enforcement is used to beef up treatment. Or so says the ACLU.
That makes sense to me. And I'm wondering, so you, Joe, as a father of two teenagers, in your experience, does telling your teenagers that they can't do something make them stop doing it or make them find more secret ways of doing it?
It depends on whether the something is, what the something is, really.
I was thinking there of campaigns against cigarette use, particularly among teens, where the follow-up studies on those campaigns showed an actual increase in cigarette use after a campaign that was attempting to show that cigarettes are unhealthy, that they're socially undesirable, that they make you look like a jerk.
Yes.
Like the teens actually like doing things that older people tell them not to do. And I would imagine they also like to do things that cops tell them not to do. So that would at least be one effect of criminalization, is it gives this illicit air, like, ooh, I'm dangerous, I'm not rule-bound, I'm a rebel.
Yes.
Which drugs have today, and it might make for a more potent pitch to a younger demographic than if the drugs were just readily available and it was no big deal to use them.
Yes, agreed. And I call that the forbidden fruit argument, and I am actually going to mention that as one of the arguments for legalization. On the other hand, scholars who have qualms about drug legalization cite what happened after gambling was legalized in the 1970s and 1980s. Up until then, most people would gamble by playing the numbers with their local bookie. As soon as states started setting up their own lotteries, the local numbers games were supplanted by huge state bureaucracies with advertising and marketing budgets, rendering what used to be a fairly small potatoes gambling market into a much more widespread activity with many more addicts. In other words, legalization would lead to more use and more abuse, particularly when the government is using it to raise revenue.
Yeah, it's true. In the criminalization scenario, you don't have billboards advertising your vice.
Yeah, so both stories sound right to me.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the issues in deciding whether you want to legalize or not. There's compelling information on both sides. And that brings me to the arguments for and against legalization. I want to start with what I think are the best reasons for continuing to prohibit drug use. The first one's going to seem counterintuitive, given those poll numbers I recited to you a minute ago about the failure of the war on drugs. But it goes like this. Drug laws writ large are effective. We know this from comparing usage rates between legal and illegal drugs. Alcohol is used by over 80% of the adult population, and tobacco use got as high as 60% of the population before the Surgeon General's famous warning. While the percentage of people using illicit drugs is below 10% for everything but marijuana. It's simply true that having the government squarely on the side of prohibition deters drug use. Even Nancy Reagan's corny Just Say No campaign contributed to a 60% decline in drug use between 1979 and 1992. Among young people in particular, the level of drug use is sensitive to price. Drug prohibition tends to keep prices higher, which makes it much tougher for teenagers to get hooked. The price of a pack of cigarettes in New York City today is $13. How many teenagers have $13 to plunk down on a pack of cigarettes? There's also the hotly debated gateway drug theory, which posits that the use of one psychoactive drug, usually marijuana, increases the probability of using other drugs. Among the explanations for this phenomenon are changes to brain chemistry as a result of using the first drug, or the social contacts one establishes with fellow drug users, and the search by some pot smokers for a better high. There's plenty of data suggesting that people who drink alcohol are more likely to use tobacco, that kids who smoke cigarettes before age 15 are much more likely to use illegal drugs, and that some, though not all, people who smoke pot move on to harder drugs. The debate is whether all that correlation equals causation.
Yeah, I'm thinking that a kid who's smoking cigarettes before the age of 15 might have other things going on within his or her life,
yes,
which makes subsequent drug use more likely. And it's not because cigarettes set him on the path. It's just because cigarettes are easier to get.
Right.
And so it's the low-hanging fruit within the drug use scenario.
Right. Or the person is more of a risk-taker personality.
Right.
And it isn't the cigarettes per se that lead to pot. There are economic costs that are not always fully taken into account by the pro-legalization side. Again, we know this most acutely when it comes to the legal drugs, alcohol and tobacco. Federal and state tax revenues on alcohol in 2007 totaled around $14.5 billion. Sounds like a lot. But that pales in comparison to the $185 billion in alcohol-related costs, including health care, lost productivity in the workplace, and criminal justice. Ditto tobacco. We spend more than $200 billion annually to address its social costs, while collecting only about $25 billion in taxes. That's a big net loser.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the health argument against drugs, which is the one I find the most persuasive. Let's take marijuana, which most people think of as the softest of illegal drugs. In 2003, the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, released a report that said the following, and I want to quote this at length because I think it's going to be surprising to you and a lot of our listeners. Quote, in 1999, a record 225,000 Americans entered substance abuse treatment primarily for marijuana dependence, second only to heroin, and not by much. Studies show that someone who smokes 5 joints a week may be taking in as many cancer-causing chemicals as someone who smokes a full pack of cigarettes every day. Marijuana contains more than 400 chemicals, including the most harmful substances found in tobacco smoke. For example, smoking one marijuana cigarette deposits about 4 times more tar into the lungs than a filtered tobacco cigarette. The short-term effects include memory loss, distorted perception, trouble with thinking and problem solving, loss of motor skills, decrease in muscle strength, increased heart rate, and anxiety. Marijuana impacts young people's mental development, their ability to concentrate in school, and their motivation and initiative to reach goals. And the risk of a heart attack is 5 times higher than usual in the hour after smoking marijuana.
It's a lot of bad things.
Yeah. What this means to me? Ingesting drugs makes you sick. It fucks up your mind and your body. Think about the multitude of health issues around alcohol and tobacco. Do we really want to increase those health risks exponentially by legalizing umpteen more poisons? Most serious people who are opposed to drug legalization agree that the so-called war on drugs has failed. They want to do prohibition differently, first by extricating the culture war from the war on drugs, and then by fully funding all the harm reduction programs that mitigate the often devastating effects of drug use on one's physical and mental health. And now for the arguments in favor of drug legalization, which at their core can be distilled to this. The war on drugs warehouses vast swaths of the population in prisons. It's horribly racist, and there's a better way. Here are some sobering statistics. There are more than 1 million arrests for drug possession each year, many of which lead to prison sentences. Even though nonviolent drug offenses account for only 20% of the people in U.S. prisons, they still lead to the incarceration of about 450,000 people on any given day.
A given day? 450,000 a day? Jeez, I was thinking that was a big number about for a year.
450,000 people are in prison because of drug use every day of the year. There's not a new 450,000 arrested every day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was alarmed. We're going to run out of people
Right.
at this rate.
Right. That will be in Trump's second term, though, I suspect.
Yeah.
According to a 2018 study from the left-leaning Center for American Progress, nearly 80% of people serving time in federal prison for drug offenses are Black or Hispanic. In state prisons, the figure is 60%. Here's a quote from that study. Black Americans are nearly 6 times more likely to be incarcerated for drug-related offenses than their white counterparts, despite equal substance usage rates. End quote. That last part is worth repeating. In every reputable study of the subject, substance abuse rates are roughly the same regardless of race. For blacks to be 6 times more likely to land in prison for substance abuse has only one explanation.
Yeah. And this came up when I was doing the research for the Defund the Police episode, too.
Yes.
That people of color are more likely to be, well, stopped and frisked, for starters. They're more likely to be arrested for drug possession. And then, having been arrested, they're more likely than white people who are arrested to be sent to prison. The slope is slanted against them in every aspect of this.
Yes.
It's a machine for sending black people to prison.
Yes, exactly. According to the ACLU, 1 in 4 young black men in America is under some form of criminal justice supervision, mostly for drug offenses. Ending the war on drugs means shrinking all those racial disparities in drug raids, arrests, sentencing, and incarceration, in addition to greatly reducing the adversarial interactions between blacks and the police that so often end in violence. Notwithstanding the economic arguments against legalization that I recited earlier, economists are actually among the people advocating for drug legalization. In 2012, Jeffrey Miron, an economist at Harvard who studies drug policy, suggested that legalizing all illegal drugs would produce net benefits to the U.S. economy of $65 billion a year, mostly by cutting spending on law enforcement and seeing reductions in crime and corruption. A study by the Rand Corporation suggested that if marijuana were legalized in California and then distributed by California to other states, Mexican drug cartels would lose 1/5 of their annual income from illegally exporting it to the United States. My wife turned me on to the work of the Columbia University linguist John McWhorter, who has been an influential voice on the pro-legalization side. He makes a non-moralistic, common-sense argument that drug legalization would make black lives better, and he bases his argument on the real-life options for black men and boys in poor and working-class neighborhoods. I want to examine his arguments in some depth. McWhorter's an African-American. He writes that, quote, with no war on drugs, there would be, within one generation, no black problem in the United States, end quote. What he means is that while poverty and educational deficits would persist even after legalization, the widespread idea that blacks in particular are in crisis would recede as soon as we stop putting black people in jail disproportionately for minor drug offenses and making them the de facto face of drug prohibition efforts. Legalizing drugs would sever the connection between drugs and crime that destroys so many black lives and blights communities. McWhorter argues that the war on drugs discourages young blacks from seeking legal employment by providing a perverse incentive to sell high-priced illegal drugs. He writes, quote, if there were no way to sell drugs on the street at a markup, then young black men who drift into this route would instead have to get legal work, end quote. He seeks the legalization of all drugs, including hard drugs like heroin and other opiates, so that they'll be priced, quote, below anything that could make a living for someone selling them on the street, end quote. To those who are horrified at the prospect of legal heroin, he writes, quote, our discomfort with the idea of heroin available at drugstores is similar to that of a prohibitionist shuddering at the thought of bourbon available at the corner store. We'll get over it, because we must, End quote.
Mm-hmm.
McWhorter believes that because black men are just as sensible, resilient, and enterprising as anyone else, in a world of legalized drugs, they would end up completing high school, getting legal jobs, and staying in the lives of their children rather than winding up in prison or dead. A black boy in an impoverished neighborhood would not see all the underskilled, drug-addicted ex-cons around him as the norm, and he would instead grow up to get a job and not have that, quote, bone-deep sense of the police, and thus whites, as an enemy, end quote, since there would no longer be any reason for the police to prowl around black neighborhoods like they do now. Whereas under the status quo of the war on drugs, that black boy is incentivized to become a street corner drug dealer, where disputes get resolved not in courts of law but on the street, and where business rivalries are not contested in the free market but via drive-by shootings and other gun-related crimes. Scores of innocent people have perished as collateral damage in the war on drugs, whether it be in street shootings or by the heavy hand of law enforcement. Let's not forget that Breonna Taylor was killed by police after a no-knock drug raid went horribly wrong.
Right.
And even if you survive the street wars, you're disproportionately likely to serve jail time if you live in an over-policed community, and that stain of a criminal record gravely damages your future job prospects.
Right. And makes it more likely that you will need to make a living henceforth as, wait for it, a drug dealer.
Yes.
Or other former criminal.
Right. So as McWhorter sees the situation for black boys today, selling drugs is the employment option that, quote, gives him the most flexible schedule, allows him to be with his favorite people, and lends him an air of the soldier besides. The question is not why he would choose to sell drugs, but why he wouldn't, end quote.
Right.
Instead of that profoundly damaging life trajectory, McWhorter implores us to imagine a day when that black boy, quote, thinks about dropping out of school and selling drugs and realizes that he can't do that because drugs are available for low prices at Rite Aid and CVS, end quote.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond McWhorter's arguments, the numbers of people advocating for legalization are growing. A former British government official with responsibility for drugs in a speech to the House of Commons said, I quote, "It is time to replace our failed drug war with a strict system of legal regulation. We must take the trade away from organized criminals and hand it to the control of doctors and pharmacists," end quote. Legal drugs would unquestionably be safer if placed under the jurisdiction of well-regulated states and localities. Lacking the quality controls that come from regulation, illegal drugs are often extremely potent or contaminated with deadly ingredients. Also, keep in mind that dirty needles helped exacerbate the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s and 1990s. Funding the war on drugs is played out as a zero-sum game. Nationwide, the enforcement of drug laws consumes over half of all police resources, which takes money away from fighting violent crimes like rape, robbery, and assault. And with so much money devoted to street-level law enforcement and the jailing of tens of thousands of low-level offenders, there's very little left to fund the drug education and treatment programs that so many people need.
Yeah.
Then there's the forbidden fruit argument that you mentioned earlier. Might legal drugs be less tempting to young people than illegal drugs are now? There's some data suggesting the answer is yes. In the Netherlands, the government decriminalized marijuana in 1976, and usage among teenagers declined measurably, from 10% prior to decriminalization to 6.5% in 1985, less than a decade later. There's also the argument that we're not aiming our drug war weapons at the real bad guys. 6 times as many people are arrested for drug possession as for the sale and manufacture of drugs. why do we continue to target the much less dangerous category of users rather than the makers and distributors, who are usually super violent, organized crime, gangs, and cartels?
Yeah, I suppose it's for the same reason that we continue to prosecute Johns in addition to prostitutes. That if the thinking is that if you attack both sides of the transaction,
Right.
that's the only way that you're going to stamp out the trade.
Supply and demand. Right. Yeah. I want to dispel one other common fear about legalization. Legalization or decriminalization doesn't mean that dope pushers would suddenly be allowed to sell heroin to your child on a street corner. It means that, like alcohol, the sale of recreational drugs would be governed by state laws establishing their potency, the time and place they can be sold, age limits for purchase, warning labels for certain medicinal substances, and making some drugs available only by prescription. States would likely create different regulations governing the use of marijuana versus cocaine or heroin. Here's an interesting side note about drug legalization's strange ideological bedfellows. In 1991, the PBS series Firing Line aired a debate between its host, the intellectual William F. Buckley, and the dean of New York City's congressional delegation, Congressman Charles Rangel. In it, the conservative Buckley argued for legalization as a way of not sending to jail the 800,000 people who had been arrested for drug offenses that year, while the liberal Rangel argued that prohibition should continue and even recommended that the war be led by a real general like Colin Powell. Buckley's longtime magazine, National Review, later editorialized in favor of the legalization of most drugs, arguing that, quote, "The war on drugs has failed. It is diverting intelligent energy away from how to deal with the problem of addiction. It is wasting our resources, and it's encouraging civil, judicial, and penal procedures associated with police states," end quote.
Yeah, I miss conservatives like Buckley. I miss conservatives who you can have an intelligent conversation with.
Right. Yeah. And the Buckley National Review argument is not very far from the argument made by New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the self-declared democratic socialist and darling of the progressive left, who supports decriminalizing drugs and cutting the budget of the DEA. According to a 2019 poll by the right-wing Cato Institute, drug decriminalization is supported by 69% of Democrats, 54% of independents, and even 40% of Republicans. The Trump-loving far-right-wing website The Daily Caller has argued against the war on drugs, as has the ACLU, as I mentioned before. There might actually be a bipartisan alliance here, albeit for different reasons. Connor Friedersdorf, writing in The Atlantic, ticked off a laundry list of wildly varying motivations for this coalition in the making, including, and I quote again, anti-racism, a mistrust of the state, a principled love of liberty, a desire to do cocaine at parties, a quasi-religious interest in the mind-expanding possibilities of psychedelics, and the experience of losing a loved one to impure drugs, end quote. That's a huge coalition if you think about it.
Yes, it is.
And now I come finally to your last question. Do I think legalization is a good idea? And this was the toughest one for me to answer. I'm convinced about this much. The war on drugs is an abject failure. It destroys the lives of countless people, and it must be abandoned immediately. Given the long and deep history of human drug use I outlined earlier, a so-called drug-free America is both naive and unrealistic. We may as well try to legislate a sex-free America. Can you picture the "say no to sex" bumper stickers?
Yeah, a return to the 50s style sleeping arrangements in which husband and wife each sleep on narrow mattresses that are separated by no less than 4 feet.
Yes, like Lucy and Ricky Ricardo, yeah. In trying to stamp out personal use by criminalizing drugs, we're basically ceding all control of these potentially dangerous substances to criminals. Mm-hmm. That just seems wrong to me. As for what should replace the war on drugs, that's the tough call. I'm glad I don't have to craft our policy going forward. But if forced to choose, I think that the regulated legalization or decriminalization of most, if not all, illegal drugs is the best way to proceed, because on balance, it's the most humane course of action. That said, I have alcoholics and nicotine addicts in my family. When I was in high school, I remember a bunch of otherwise smart guys, and they were all guys, who smoked too much pot and turned into what we called burnouts. My best friend couldn't hold a job in his 20s. He had a lot of thwarted dreams. I always believed his daily drug use was the main impediment holding him back. I want to see a world where people have real pathways to happiness that don't involve normalizing what I view as self-destructive, pathological behavior. I think we need an enlightened drug policy that doesn't surrender to a culture of drug use. And what about you?
Yeah, I think we're probably pretty close. I do think that there's a harm reduction aspect around which I think most people would agree, which is that the strategy of sending hundreds of thousands of people to prison, apparently 6/7 of which are just for possession rather than manufacture or sale. That strategy, all it does is benefit the prison industrial complex.
Yes.
And we are continuing to pay for that just in terms of the taxes that support those prisons. And then we pay for it when those people come out of those prisons and are essentially unemployable because of a felony record. And it's been a blight on our history over the last 100 years, and it cannot end soon enough. So I'm fully on board with decriminalization of at least most drugs. I think that that's just common sense.
Right. And since this is happening in real life, your own state, my state, which is probably going to decriminalize marijuana this year, we're going to see this experiment play out across the United States in the state incubators and adjust accordingly.
Yeah. Marijuana is fully legalized for sale here in Washington, and there's a pot shop that's 2 blocks from where I live, and it is without a doubt the most successful local business in our neighborhood. Like throughout the pandemic, there continues to be a line out the door of consistently young people showing up to buy their pot. And I have to say that concerns me a little bit, but I think it's remarkable what we can get used to in this country. Like you've mentioned, what we just accept as normal when it comes to alcohol and cigarette consumption, and then the cost of those things. And it also brings to mind the just mind-numbing number of traffic fatalities that happen in this country. And no one is up in arms about it because it's just normal that many people die because of car accidents.
Yes.
And so it's distressing how ready we are to think that, hundreds, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people dying or going to prison. That's just what happens. That's just life. And
yes. And this whole phenomenon of acceptance of risk is a fascinating thing that's applicable to COVID too. That would make a great podcast someday.
Right.
One of us should tackle that.
Yes, yes. When we talk about legalization, though, I ran across an article on Vox.com called "I Used to Support Legalizing All Drugs, Then the Opioid Epidemic Happened" by German Lopez. And he points out something that I think is very important, which is we have recent history of what happens in the context of legalization with something that was extremely addictive, which is that a pharmaceutical company with questionable ethics began lobbying the government and got laws passed that required insurance companies to cover the drugs that they were producing. And they were offering faulty studies about how effective their pills were against chronic pain, and got doctors prescribing their drugs for conditions that did not require it. And the outcome of that is just an incredible human cost. And so I think it's naive to think that suddenly pharmaceutical companies are going to step up and be responsible going forward. It's naive to think that politicians are suddenly going to be resistant to lobbying on behalf of corporations that actually carries a heavy social cost. They are not going to go to bat for the American public because they never do. And so legalization, I think, it would be a disaster, frankly, because the companies that would profit from it enormously would drive their own profits, their own share price. They would do what corporations do, which is do what's good for the company and not what's good for the society. And then the rest of us would be left to pick up the pieces.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And the reason I'm not sure is because government done well means regulations, and we used to have a fully functioning federal government that was well regulated, and states and localities, many of them continue to be well regulated. So I think the Biden presidency and the days to come are going to be a real test to whether good government can actually make a comeback and become an integral part of people's lives again. And if it can, then we might be able to pull off even legalized drugs with a correct enforcement and regulatory regime in place.
I would like to believe that you're correct. I confess that what I just said was coming from a sort of weary cynicism that perhaps I've arrived at because of the last 4 years that we've all lived through. But I would like to believe that you're right. So do you have a question for me for next time?
I do. 3 words. Boxers or briefs? Just kidding.
Be a quick one.
Just kidding. I'm sure that would make for a tremendous podcast.
And I think the public is clamoring to know what my answer to that question would be.
Yes. Maybe that'll be an extra for Facebook. Okay, here's my question. The recent federal antitrust lawsuits against Facebook and Google got my attention because they seem to be one of the few areas where both sides of our polarized political culture agree. Everybody hates the social media companies, though for very different reasons. I think we're up to 48 states that joined the suit against Facebook, and there are at least 3 separate federal and state actions against Google. So here's my question to you. Should these big tech companies be broken up? And special bonus points awarded to you, Mark, if you can explain antitrust law and why it has been neglected for so long, because that's another thing I'm wondering about.
Okay. Antitrust in the tech sector. That's a big and woolly topic.
Yeah.
I will take it on. So
thank you.
Thank you for asking, and I'll see what I can find.
All right.
So if you have any thoughts on this episode or would like to leave comments on previous episodes, we have a Facebook page now. You can find it at Mansplaining Podcast. I hope you come by, like our page, leave a few comments, or even pose a question, and we might answer it in a future episode. And this is it for this episode, so thank you for joining us, and I hope you'll come around next time.
Talk to you soon.
That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.